What's up, everybody? This is Matt Kajeski with Awesemo.com, and we are here today to analyze the three keys to this week's MMA DFS slate covering UFC 252, the title bout between Daniel Cormier and Stipe Miocic. Be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you know when this and all other Awesemo content goes live. So we have the highly anticipated trilogy fight between Cormier and Miocic. The winner, likely considered the greatest heavyweight of all time. So there's three keys to this DFS slate we're going to talk about. We need to talk about which fights you want to target, high upside fights, fights with KO potential. We'll talk some chalk, always very important. And last, we'll talk leverage, ways you could potentially get different to take down that big prize this weekend in your GPPs. So first, we have the high upside KO potential fights, aka the fights that are most likely to score well for DFS purposes this weekend. And we need to start with Stipe Miocic and Daniel Cormier, our 5-round title fight. Of course, your 5-rounders. Those 2 extra rounds just leave more potential for DFS scoring. So across the platforms, on DraftKings in particular, we have Cormier at 8K, Miocic at 8.2. On FanDuel, $19 and $20 respectively for those fighters. And then 1.9 times for Cormier on SuperDraft, 1.95 for Miocic. So across betting platforms, we're seeing Cormier come in as the slight favorite, minus 115. I'm expecting him to be the higher owned favorite because of that. And he'll likely push for the highest owned fighter on this slate. But that's for good reason. You know, in this fight, the two fighters are both highly aggressive. Miocic is landing the second most significant strikes on this card at 4.95. And Cormier ranks 4th in the same stat, 4.25 for him. In their previous matchup, we actually saw Cormier land 181 strikes. Miocic came in at 123. Now, we're getting this fight in the smaller octagon at the UFC Apex facility in Las Vegas, likely pressing even more action. Grappling? Neither guy has focused too much on this in the past, but both Miocic and Cormier have landed takedowns. In particular, the second fight, each of them landed a takedown. Miocic lands the 7th most takedowns on this card, 2.2, implementing his wrestling a bit. And then Cormier hasn't used the wrestling quite as much, but he's been very vocal in interviews this week. Did an interview with ESPN where he says he really wants to focus on the grappling game plan. Historically, both fighters score extremely well for DFS purposes, and we even saw Cormier drop 102 points in a loss. This loss occurred against Miocic. Now, some people will stack this fight, and that has some merit, especially in cash games. However, this fight is plus 170 to go the distance, meaning bookmakers are predicting an early stoppage. If that stoppage occurs in the first round, you're likely ending up with one fighter with a poor score. So in your GPPs, I still do not recommend this strategy. But this is a fight we want to target, probably one we want at least one fighter of in every matchup. The second fight, with a lot of upside, we want to potentially look at Sugar Sean O'Malley taking on Marlon Vera. Now, Sean O'Malley is going to be one of your most expensive fighters across platforms, $9,200 on DraftKings, $21 on FanDuel, 1.5 times on SuperDraft. Marlon Vera running this back, he is one of the cheapest. Now, we currently have O'Malley. He's minus 290, minus 300, depending on the betting platform of choice, but he's going to be an extremely popular fighter. He's popular outside the cage. He's very aggressive, landing 6.86 strikes per minute. That is the most aggressive striker we have on this card. On the other side, Vera's landing the 7th most significant strikes, 3.7, but we've seen him get into aggressive firefights before. He just landed 92 strikes against Song Yadong, allowing 101 himself. From a grappling perspective, neither of these guys is exactly the most aggressive. Vera lands just shy of 1 takedown on average, but he is a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He managed 2 takedowns in his previous bout. O'Malley has just 61% takedown defense, so if you are going the route taking the cheap underdog here, that is a potential path to victory for Vera. He does, O'Malley on the other side has a little bit of underrated skills, I think, in the takedown game himself. I don't think he implements this strategy as much here, but he is someone who fought on Quintet Ultra promotion that focused entirely on grappling for the UFC, who he represented there. Historically, both fighters are scoring well, and they're finishing most of their fights. O'Malley finished 75% of his wins. Vera has finished 87%. This fight is minus 110 to go the distance. So it's semi-likely for an early stoppage here, which we know always helps with scoring on these DFS platforms. From a stylistic perspective, we know Vera will push forward. He's potentially going to shoot some takedowns. And O'Malley has shown an aggressive style throughout his fights so far in his career. The winner at this fight, from this fight, has a very good shot at the optimal. And the last really high-paced fight we'll talk about today, a lot of it is coming from this guy, Merab Dvalishvili, taking on John Dodson. Middling prices here for Merab, $8,700 on DraftKings, $18 on FanDuel. He is 1.65 multiplier on SuperDraft. Dodson coming in as the underdog here, $7,500, $14 and 2.2 times on SuperDraft. We've seen a ton of live movement in this spot. Dvalishvili opened minus 190. He now stands at minus 240, depending on the sports book you are looking at. And we know Merab's game. We know his wrestling pedigree. This guy averages, now I'm not mistaken here, 17.34 takedown attempts per bout. And he's landing 8.67. These are ridiculous takedown numbers, and he has 25 takedowns in his last two fights combined. Both of these were decisions. Now, Dodson, he has 80% takedown defense, but he has allowed at least one takedown in 4 of his last matches. Even if Dodson is able to limit some of the takedowns, Merab lands the 5th most strikes per minute on this card, 4.01. On the other side, Dodson absolutely can't be counted out. He's fought some of the best competition in the division, taking on Petr Yan, Jimmy Rivera in his 2 most recent fights. Dodson even landed a pair of takedowns against each of those guys, and Yan has 88% takedown defense. Rivera has 92% takedown defense, so that is no small feat in and of itself. While this fight is maybe a little less aggressive than the 2 prior, and Dodson probably the less aggressive fighter between the 2, he still has a path to victory in a small cage, and with such a cheap price, he's likely entering the optimal as well, with Merab, his up-tempo style, likely pushing the pace on the other side. It is minus 290 to go the distance. I don't think that matters. We've seen Merab score extremely well in decisions, including 174 points in his most recent decision. So those are my 3 high upside fights. I think you do want a fighter from one fighter from one or more of these fights. Particularly, you're trying to get all 3. But as we'll talk later, that could be a chalky roster construction, which brings me to our second topic, navigating chalk. So first thing here, we know Cormier and Miocic are going to carry immense ownership, particularly on DraftKings, where the pricing is driven by odds and bookmakers overall. It's a close, almost a pick 'em really. So Miocic and Cormier, they come in as the 8,200 8K fight on DraftKings, making them extremely affordable. This kind of opens the door to target some expensive fighters. It's not out of the realm of possibility to get one of the title fight, O'Malley, and then taking Merab all in the same lineup. So this is going to be a chalky roster construction. Of course, Merab coming off that 174-point decision, he'll be popular. O'Malley's popular, aggressive, strong betting favorite, he'll be popular. And then there's another fighter we didn't talk about that probably will carry some ownership in Herbert Burns. He's in the prelim. Brother of Gilbert Burns, he opened as a minus 200 favorite, but he's jumped all the way to minus 280 at various sports books. He's absurdly minus 175 to finish that fight early. Burns has finished both of his UFC opponents by submission, and his opponent, Daniel Pineda, has been finished 6 times via submission. So expecting some heavy ownership there. Navigating that's going to be really important. I think if you pivot away from one of those fighters right away, you'll naturally be a little bit more contrarian. Of course, leaving salary on the table if you do play 3 or 4 of those guys, really important here as well. On FanDuel, these are 4 of the most expensive fighters on the slate, making roster construction a little bit more difficult there. And I think that will alleviate some ownership concerns right away. On DraftKings, we are going to have the problem of that chalky roster construction. So, of course, you can leave salary on the board, or you can fade some of these fights outright and take a look at some leverage spots, which is what we'll finish with here, our third topic, taking a look at some leverage fights that still do maybe have some upside. The first one is Jairzinho Rozenstruik taking on Junior Dos Santos, former champion himself. Now, this fight is not the most aggressive. It's kind of middle in the pack as far as pace goes. Dos Santos is the more aggressive fighter. He lands the 3rd most significant strikes on the slate, 4.66 per minute. In his 3 most recent decisions, we have DraftKings scores of 110, 157, and 123. On top of that, for Dos Santos, he has a 76% finish rate. He's particularly intriguing on FanDuel, I think, where he's just $15 On DraftKings, he comes in at 7,800, and then the multiplier 2.05 on SuperDraft. Now, he might be one of the more popular underdogs, so if you want to go the other route and take Rosenstrike as a favorite, maybe fade Merab or one of the other favorites that will carry heavier ownership, you're looking at a striking monster who's finished 9 of 10 wins via knockout kickboxing savant. He isn't quite as aggressive as Dos Santos, but most of his fights are ending early, and we get a guy here who is minus 108 to finish this in the distance. An early KO could absolutely catapult Rosenstrike and your lineup up the leaderboards this week. The next fight I think you want to look at for potential leverage, Jim Miller taking on Vince Pichel. This is the 8,300, 7,900 matchup on DraftKings. Miller is $16 on FanDuel, Pichel just $15. And both of these guys 1.95 and 1.9x on SuperDraft. They're a pair of grapplers. And this is really intriguing because neither of these guys is really experienced in takedown defense. Pichel, 22% takedown defense. Miller, 46% takedown defense. Respectively, Miller has 18 wins via submission, averages 1.68 takedowns per bout. Pichel surprisingly doesn't have any submission wins, but he ranks 5th in takedowns landed on this slate at 4 exactly on average. Someone's getting taken down here. I don't know how often or if we see an early submission, which also scores well, but I'm particularly interested on DraftKings. Pichel is cheaper here, but he's now the favorite, so I'm anticipating some ownership there. If you really want to get some leverage, taking a look at Jim Miller could be the key to this slate. As far as a couple newcomers you might want to look at, we know in fights without big samples, and we have a few of these on this slate, ownership tends to be a little bit depressed. Now we have a heavyweight newcomer matchup between Parker Porter and Chris Daukaus. Of course, two newcomers, little information on either of these guys. Sometimes we just generally see these guys go lower owned than they should be. And this fight in particular is interesting because it is plus 245 to go the distance, meaning an early finish is fairly likely in this spot. If we get a 100-point score from an early knockout, the winner likely enters the optimal lineup here. We also have this phenomenon with TJ Brown and Danny Chavez. Similar situation, Brown has just one UFC fight on the profile, and Chavez is making his UFC debut. Brown, he lands the second most takedowns based on that limited sample. We can always take away, the grappling edges there in DFS. And then if he's pressing the pace, Chavez probably isn't a terrible underdog to play either, just in an overall aggressive fight. So I'd look at those ones too. The female fights are the least aggressive on this slate and the least likely to finish. So tread lightly here. But with that said, they're likely going to provide the most leverage just because they are the lowest owned fighters overall. In particular, the Jandiroba Felice Herrig fight is interesting. Jandiroba super expensive at $9K, but Felice Herrig, this is her first fight since tearing her ACL. So at least one to monitor. This is basically GPP only territory for me, but they should be some of the lowest owned fighters on the slate. One fight that is difficult to analyze at this point is Kai Kamaka, Tony Kelly. Now, we don't have pricing at this point in the week. I'm expecting it to come soon. But these are two UFC newcomers. They are a replacement fight after the Kutalaba and Kalaya fight was canceled earlier this week. We have no information on these guys. Basically, all we know, Kamaka, former college wrestler at Midland College, veteran of Bellator and a few other promotions. On the other side, Kelly is an older prospect. He's only fought one time since 2016, was originally on the show MTV Caged, and he suffered a decision loss to UFC fighter Kevin Aguilar at one point. But again, low-level fight, could go either way. And right now, we're seeing lines open up. Kamaka, minus 185. It has moved to minus 230 since we've gotten some spreads on this. And I'm anticipating the prices, on DraftKings, Kamaka's probably going to be somewhere in the upper 8Ks. Kelly probably somewhere in the low 7Ks. We just don't have a lot of information, so I'm guessing both guys go lower owned. I'm willing to take my shot really on either one here in just hopes that they rocket you up the leaderboards in a GPP. But that is it. That is the slate. Of course, for more information, check out Awesemo.com. We have weekly MMA passes. We also have a ton of free content, including the MMA DFS strategy show going live Thursday evening. We also have the Live Before Lock show, leading you right up to the start of the fights on Saturday. Also, Awesemo has released a ton of new products, including the fantasy football draft kit. It's August. Fantasy's upon us, so make sure to check that out. Otherwise, if you have questions, I'm on Twitter at Matt_Gajeski. Best of luck to everyone out there, and let's make some money on this slate.